Joining us now, David Simmonds, Shadow Minister for Levelling Up and Housing and Communities. I don't think I've had the pleasure before. It's good to see you. Congratulations on the post. Let's start with China, should we? What on earth is going on? And should we be being as cosy with China as we are?
The UK's relationship with China is a close one in terms of trade, but it's had its ups and downs over the last few years. You probably remember David Cameron talking about a new golden era.
I do.
Since when Chinese government has cracked down, for example, on freedoms in Hong Kong, and the UK has responded. Now, when we were in government, we had something called the FIRST scheme, the Foreign Interest Registration Scheme, which was to require people who were working as agents of other governments to register that fact. So there was a high degree of transparency for universities, for diplomats, for business about what they were here to do. Now, clearly, the new government took office and delayed the implementation of that scheme. But given the events and what's been reported in the news in the last few days, it's clear they need to come forward with some clear proposals so that we can ensure that our industrial base, that our government, our politics are kept free from undue influence.
Why didn't you implement it?
Well, the Foreign Interest Registration Scheme was specifically about that. It was ready to go when we left office. Tom Tugendhat, who is the Security Minister, talked about that in the Commons yesterday. Now, clearly, the government took the view that they didn't wish to implement that, I think because they want to see a closer relationship with China and they're concerned about its diplomatic impact. But our argument is because that wouldn't require introduction of additional tensions between the UK government and China. It simply would introduce transparency about what people were here to do.
I get it.
It's a good way forward to address those concerns.
But why didn't you implement it when you were in power?
Well, we brought it forward. It was ready to go when we left office.
40 years.
And over that period, the UK's relationship with China changed in many different ways. And the reason we brought forward that scheme was because we recognised as we were able to get more information about how China and other countries like Russia were operating, what were effective measures to ensure that degree of transparency was there.
You could have done it if you'd wanted to, you just didn't. A spokesperson for Prince Andrew has said nothing of a sensitive nature was ever discussed between this alleged spy and the Duke of York. Do you think his team is qualified to make that assumption?
Well, that's something that will be for the security services to take a view about.
You don't have a view of your own?
Well, clearly, I don't know exactly what the Duke of York may have known in terms of...
I mean, how can they possibly say that it was nothing of a sensitive nature was ever discussed? How do they know?
Well, with members of the royal family, with diplomats, with other people operating at high levels, there may well be records of the interactions that they have, and they may be taking that view on the basis of that. But we need to know that. We need to make sure that, especially where something has come to light about an individual or a group of individuals, that we know what secrets, what information that might be commercially confidential, for example, and damaging to British business interests might have been acquired by that route. And we need to make sure that we can put a stop to that.
Yeah, it'd probably be better if he doesn't get involved with foreign nationals in future, though.
Well, it's clearly...
There was a question mark at the end of that.
It's clearly a question. I mean, I think anybody who's engaged in diplomacy, in representing the UK, is always going to come across situations where there's a risk of conflict of interest. That's why we need that degree of transparency. So if you know that somebody may be seeking to gain undue influence on behalf of another government, whichever government that may be, if you know that that's the case, then you can make a judgment about what you share, what degree of influence you give them accordingly. And that's why that element of transparency is so vital.
Your opposite number, Angela Rayner, has promised a mayor for every region of England. What do you make of that?
The concern that we have is the government's come forward with a top-down approach. And when we were in government, we were very much of the view that local areas should be able to choose the arrangements that best suited them. So we know that across the north of England, for example, we've got pretty much comprehensive coverage of mayors, and in other major cities we have that. But some rural areas felt that different arrangements to reflect their local requirements were appropriate. We want to recognise that the UK, with its very diverse geography, its changing population density, its changing local need, is able to identify the solutions that work locally, rather than having somebody in Whitehall say, this one size has to fit all. So
you think it's a good idea in principle?
The principle is one which we supported in government. It's something which we took forward. We've seen mayors like Ben Houchen, like Andy Street, who was until recently the mayor in the Midlands, driving forward an agenda supported by a Conservative government, not, in their cases, charging any mayoral taxes either. But if we look at the example here in London, where I'm a Member of Parliament, there's been a huge increase. It costs every household a bandy council tax, £471 a year, to have a mayor. And I think we'd ask whether those arrangements are delivering the kind of value for money and quality services that people in the capital want to see. So we need to make sure that there's that element of local flexibility rather than somebody in a Whitehall department saying everybody should. Well, they do, that's a matter of fact, but we want to make sure.
Is that the case in Greater Manchester?
We want to make sure that the arrangements that we have in place reflect local need.
Is that the same in Greater Manchester? Does the mayor cost more there?
The mayors all over the country have different arrangements the way they do it, but I think it's very clear that two Conservative mayors, like Ben Houchen and Andy Street, they've driven forward the economic regeneration of the area, focused on employment, and they've not raised a mayoral precept at all. They've charged nil.
As has Andy Burnham, and I think Andy Burnham gives 15% of his salary to charity as well, so can't criticise all Labour mayors, can you?
Well, I'm sure Andy Burnham is very popular in Greater Manchester, and we've seen him as a figurehead for that city. The question we always have to ask is that form of local leadership? And in Greater Manchester, given it's a metropolitan area with a major focus on economic growth, that arrangement is probably one that works correctly. But if we look at some of the more rural parts of the United Kingdom, we look at what's being said, for example, by local leaders in Cornwall or on the south coast, in Cumbria, then imposing a mayoral arrangement to a footprint that's designed in central government may not be the way of meeting the needs and aspirations of those local people.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Simmonds. It's good to talk to you. Thank you.